Before we begin, I first want to acknowledge that the University of Minnesota Twin Cities is built on the traditional homelands of the Dakota people. It is important to acknowledge the peoples on whose land we live, learn, and work as we seek to improve and strengthen our relations with our tribal nations. We also acknowledge that words are not enough. We must ensure that our institution provides support, resources, and programs that increase access to all aspects of higher education for our American Indian students, staff, faculty, and community members. And we really take this seriously here in the history department, where we are very proud to be home to a really stellar program in American Indian history with faculty and graduate students. So welcome to this edition of the History Department, University of Minnesota History Department Book Club. I'm Sarah Chambers, the chair of the History Department, and I thank you for joining us on, for those of you who are in Minnesota, an unusual sort of summer before spring day. So thank you for taking the time out to hop onto Zoom. This is a series in which we highlight the works of faculty and alumni and get a chance to keep in touch and see what people are working on. And so at the beginning, we'll hear from the author, Todd Cleveland, about his book. Then we'll have a conversation on the book between Todd and Igor Chukrin. And then towards the end of the hour, there'll be a chance for you to pose questions by placing them in the chat. You can, of course, put your questions in there whenever you want, and I will read them out when we get to that part of the Q&A. And I want to thank Clayton Smith, who organizes this for us and stays behind the scenes in case we need technical assistance, which sometimes we do. So it's really a pleasure to welcome back our esteemed alum, Todd Cleveland, today. And we're going to be talking about his book, A History of Tourism in Africa, Exoticization, Exploitation, and Enrichment, published 2021 with Ohio University Press as part of their Africa in World History series. And Todd has written about all kinds of interesting, he has a book on diamonds, he's written about sports, and now about tourism, and he has a monograph coming out as well this summer on history of tourism, specifically in Mozambique. So some of that is featured in this book, but the book is a larger overview of the theme. And we're also joined by a faculty member in the history department, Igor Chukrin, who also specializes in the history of tourism from a European perspective. And so it'll be interesting to have a conversation in that sense about sort of north-south and global connections and so forth. And Igor, I think, didn't overlap with Todd, so he's one of our newer faculty members. We're really excited to have him join us as well. So with that, I think I will go ahead and turn things over to Todd to introduce the book, and then we'll start the conversation with Igor.
Fantastic. Thank you, Sarah. Thank you, Clayton. Thank you, Igor. Thanks for everyone. It's nice to be back, if only digitally, I suppose. When Clayton extended this offer, gosh, it must have been October. It seems so far away. So we're finally here. We've made it. So thank you again. This book, well, honestly, it was a bit of a diversion. I was working on the monograph that Sarah cited regarding history of tourism in colonial Mozambique. And I thought it would be great if we knew a little bit more about the history of tourism Africa-wide instead of, I mean, there's been very little done, as you might imagine, a handful of journal articles. This is the first book, and it's by no means a monograph. It's to a good extent, it's a synthesization of what's currently available, which is, really sort of eclectic, disparate set of journal articles. It's largely been the domain of anthropologists, tourism in Africa. So there's been very little historical work done. I think some of the things that motivated me, like I said, I mean, this was a diversion from that project, I suppose, a productive, healthy diversion. But the types of themes that are sort of engaged in the book, are things I talk about with my students, whether on study abroad programs, trying to determine or have them determine if they're tourists or engaged in something more profound, which is always a bit unsettling for them because, of course, they don't want to be perceived as tourists and would not self-identify that way. But of course, in many respects, they are. And also in class where students, most of my students haven't been to Africa, but most of the students who enroll in my classes have some degree of interest in going to Africa. So, and that would almost inherently be as a tourist. And so we've had these discussions sort of informally over the years. And so I thought it'd be interesting to really kind of generate a broad history from the very sort of origins of tourism, probably endeavors that wouldn't even reasonably be described as tourism, all the way up to the sort of more recent forms of tourism, sex tourism, voluntourism, all these sorts of more recent developments or more recent varieties of tourism. And so it's been was an enjoyable project. Unfortunately, it came out during COVID, so I actually had to look this morning to see when it was published because, of course, we all lost all sense of time during COVID. So it's been out for a couple of years, but I haven't really done anything with it because my energies have been focused elsewhere, and it just sort of came out. And then, I mean, I use it in class, but usually you'd have an array of talks about a particular project in which you're engaged, especially upon the publication of a new book. But this sort of just came out to little to no fanfare, of course. And it's just been kind of sitting there other than my utilization of it in the classroom. So I'm happy to sort of re-engage with it. It prompted me to revisit the contents over the last few days. So thanks for that as well. Always a healthy endeavor. It's intended for an undergraduate audience. As Sarah mentioned, it appears in the Africa and World History series at Ohio University Press, which I co-edit. And so, I mean, this book is it fits really well in the series where we're trying to place Africa and African topics in a broader sort of global context with books that are intended for undergraduate readers. So it's not monographical in any sense, nor is it intended to be. I mean, it really, I'm hoping that my students and anyone else who might read it just sort of thinks a bit more critically about tourism on the continent and the power dynamics, the human dynamics, the sort of good and bad, if you will, that tourism contributes, but just be more critically aware of what that undertaking or how that undertaking impacts so many different people in so many different ways, communities as well. So I would hope by the end of a couple hundred pages, you'd have a much more informed, critical understanding of the impact of tourism, both currently and historically. So those are sort of the general or broad aims, I suppose, of the book, the motivation for writing it and the target audience.
All right, so shall we open it up to a conversation then with Igor, who may have some questions to ask you about the book?
Sure.
Yeah. Thank you, Sarah. Thank you, Clayton, and thank you, Todd. I'm thrilled to be here and talked about your book. I must say, I truly enjoy reading your book. I think it is extremely well written, engaging, informative, and as you mentioned, also it is important because we do not have such a book for Africa, and in 175 pages, you covered a lot of ground. You brought us to Ghana, to Tunisia, to South Africa, to Mozambique, to Tanzania. So it is just itself is a tour de force that you did it here and basically bringing us from the colonial era to the 21st century. And what I also like in your book is that the many examples or accounts you refer to show the complexity of question you address in this book, because we can think here of the racial dimension in tourism, the labor dimension also of tourism. We have colonialism and its legacies, the diverse impacts of tourism, both negative and positive, but also the ways in which modern tourism started in the 19th century and became the global industry that it is now. And we have that in your book. We have everything. I think you you achieve your goal. If your goal was to let your student understand that tourism is a complex affair, and you did it with brio, so it's great. And I would like to use some of your chapters in my class, I think, and because also what Todd didn't mention is that at the end of the book you have discussion questions for each chapter, and this is very well done. It's very legible and accessible to a general audience. And of course, because it was geared towards a undergrad audience, I was sometimes a little bit unsettled because you started a conversation about ethical questions. Should we renovate those European-built castles that serve to place for before the Middle Passage for slaves? Should we renovate them or not? And we have similar questions about Nazi camps. So, and you just started conversation and then you did not very develop. So but I understand that you could not include everything in a short book, and the goal here was different. So I was about to ask you what brought you to the history of tourism, but I think you already covered that, and I appreciate this. So my first question is about because your book offers a story of misconceptions and stereotypes about Africa and how tourism was shaped by them, but also how the act of traveling itself to Africa reinforced those stereotypes and preconceived ideas about the continent. And among these myths, there's the image of in Africa, which is untouched, right? Pure continent, a place where visitors could grasp what life was 1,000 years ago. And this type of image circulated during the colonial era, but decolonization did not change this stereotype, which continued then to be widely used among tourism promoters. And not only what we can expect at North American or European tourism promoters, but also African promoters. So are we dealing here with smart tourism promoters who exploit an easily legible trope for commercial purposes? And the story of exploitation of natural or human resources in link with tourism is also enduring a enduring story that didn't end with the political independence after World War II. So we have here many continuities between the colonial and post-colonial era. And I would like to understand here, like, what should we make out of these long-lasting trends?
Sure. I mean, yeah, it's a great question, and it's hopefully one that's explored at least reasonably thoroughly in the book. I think we talked a little bit about this the other day. If you look at the transition from colonialism or colonization to decolonization, the independence period, there are a great many continuities. One of the most striking is this idea of this sort of pristine landscape that you mentioned. This was important in the early days of the tourism industry in Africa, that you could sort of travel back in time to this pristine, unsullied place that was unaffected by modernity in a very welcoming, inviting way. To sort of leave the hecticness and the frenetic sort of nature of industrial society behind and travel not only somewhere different, but back in time to a different era, to an unidentified era, of course. And so what was striking in many respects is that the colonial governments, rather than challenging or addressing this misperception, reinforced it. They had all colonial governments, all post-colonial governments had opportunities to return communities that had been forcibly relocated from ancestral lands in order to create game parks, sanctuaries, et cetera, during the colonial period, but absolutely none of them did so. I mean, there were a handful, Tanzania being one of them, that sort of made some noise about it, but ultimately they all opted that the revenue generating opportunities from hunting safaris, but more commonly camera safaris in the post-colonial era were more important. Those were prioritized over over supporting indigenous communities to return to lands that they had once inhabited. And it's particularly important in Africa because there's such strong connections between communities and the land upon which they occupy that often are linked via origin stories. So being in a particular place is necessity for self-identification, not only for access to resources and things like that. So they're extremely important. But again, the independent governments opted to sort of pursued this sort of continuity with the colonial period rather than making a more abrupt break. There were also considerations regarding the beneficiaries of tourism. This is an industry obviously geared largely toward the global north. In fact, some African governments treat tourism as an export. In other words, it's generated locally but made for foreign consumption. So that's actually not that hard or not that much of a stretch. And so again, you see these independent governments sort of pursuing or extending or perpetuating colonial policy in a really sort of uncritical way. Their heads were turned by the prospect of revenues that were being touted by the World Bank, by a number of international institutions, developmental economists as well. There was a sort of a largely uncritical engagement with tourism. There was a great deal of optimism that it could generate revenue for non-industrialized developing nations, as it had done in the Caribbean, for example, in the 1950s and 60s, and in certain places or locations in Asia as well. And so Africa sort of just became the next logical place to apply the sort of the principles, the practices, et cetera, of what was then a burgeoning tourism industry. And of course, with long flight jet travel, it became more accessible, more affordable for people. And so Africa was sort of poised to, at least on paper in many respects, benefit from the sort of revenue that tourism was promised to generate. There were unfortunately myriad challenges to that. Probably the primary one was that the capital was all foreign, or mostly foreign. And so when hotels were being constructed, et cetera, these are underwritten by foreign banks and operated by foreign companies. If you know much about the colonial experience in Africa, you'll know that there were very few opportunities for Africans for higher education, managerial positions, for example. And so there simply weren't individuals who had the experience running reasonably large operations, whether they were in tourism or in any other industry, mainly mining, agriculture, et cetera. And so there was ultimately, this looks like yet another strand of neocolonialism, where there's a dependence on foreign capital, on foreign expertise, for local generation of jobs, revenues, et cetera. And so you can understand why some of or virtually all African governments chose to pursue tourism as a revenue generating prospect for countries that had very little diversity within their domestic economies, because of the nature of colonial economics. And so you could understand how appealing this would have been for these new African leaders. And if it meant portraying African space as something it was not, that wasn't something that caused them to lose sleep at night. They were very actively participating in the promotion of Africa as an exotic, pristine, alien sort of space that was dangerous, but also could be visited extremely safely, with the right precautions. So there's always this sort of underlying sense of danger and adventure that's still used today. That language is still utilized by tourist agencies in promoting Africa. Sorry, that was probably far too long of an answer to your question.
This is a great answer. And of course, they always play on this kind of sense of danger, but also you'll be also at home, you will find what you need. So they play on those two aspects to attract tourists. And you're totally right that the history of tourism in Africa, in many ways, we have similar trends in the world in the late 60s, 70s, where across the board, there was a lot of optimism about tourism. That could be the key to redistribute wealth in the world, and the key for development, also the key for global peace. Mm-hmm. And well, now we know that it's not the case. Wow. And one of the main questions you address is whether tourism is good or bad. And of course, you explain that the question cannot be addressed so simply, but we have it here this question from the beginning. And then you share a series of examples, especially in the last chapter on newer forms of tourism. You mentioned volunteerism, ecotourism, cultural tourism, trophy hunting. And here there's something about Minnesota in this, because there's the infamous veterinarian,
the dentist who killed.
Yeah. A dentist, yeah, who illegally shot a lion in 2015. So we have a little bit of Minnesota in your book. This is great. But here in this chapter, you offer the pro and cons about those newer forms of tourism. But throughout the book, you don't take sides, really. You kind of, or at least not explicitly. And why so? Was there a pedagogical goal behind this to let your students decide, find their own answers?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I wanted to sort of, I guess it's the way I teach as well. I want them to make informed sort of critical decisions based on the information that they have. And so they're having to analyze that themselves as much as is possible. You're absolutely right regarding the last chapter. That's a less balanced account of various forms of tourism. So I'm a little more, maybe it's not explicit, but you'd have to be a reasonably dense reader not to pick up on the sort of critical tone that I adopt in that last chapter. It's hard to, I mean, there's some of the aspects of tourism that I outline there. It's really hard to offer much of a balanced account. And so, again, maybe my guard was let down, and I deviated from the prior chapters and being clearly a bit more critical of these more recent forms of tourism, even ecotourism, cultural tourism. I mean, obviously there are benefits to both of those forms of tourism, but there are some real sort of problematic dimensions to those as well. So even though those appear in the same chapter, I want, students, I think probably, I would imagine most students, if you mention ecotourism, would think that that's a positive thing, and how could there be sort of any?
They do, yeah, they do.
Yeah, absolutely, yes. I mean, just sort of poking at that a little bit, and again, wanting them to think more deeply, more critically about all of these forms of tourism across time and space, and so that they'd be a more informed traveler, or if they never go, at least have a heightened awareness of the dynamics involved in tourism that are applicable as in your work as well. I mean, globally.
Yeah. Well, also there's oftentimes there are new labels on old forms of tourism. So, and I thought of your book because when I visited the zoo in Rochester, not in upstate New York, not a long time ago, and in the safari section in the zoo, and here I would like to go back to the camera safari, and there's a board in the safari section of the zoo entitled "Why Go on Safari," and with the photo of George Eastman. And the photo is in black and white, of course, and he is standing next to a dead elephant. And one could read next to the photo, I quote, "George Eastman with the elephant he killed on safari. When Eastman was 72 years old, the age most people want to take life easy, he went on safari to Africa. While there, he hunted many animals, including an elephant." And then we have next to this photo, color photo with the following captions. "We saw elephants. We used binoculars, I guess, as opposed to guns. Yeah. We got very close to the animals." And I think that what I saw there illuminates very well what you describe in chapter 5, namely the rise of camera safari and how the colonial project of safari tourism morphed into a Western pattern of experiencing Africa. And as if Africa is seen as a zoo or a natural history museum, and also framing Eastman as a courageous hunter despite his old age, falls into a very traditional narrative of heroism associated with safari. And the goal with camera safari is not to kill animals anymore, of course, but it's still associated with image of personal accomplishment, with a kind of once in a lifetime experience. And I would like you to comment a little bit on this and maybe explain us the importance of camera safari in contemporary tourism in Africa, because I think you mentioned that is the kind of the quintessential experience of tourism that a lot of Westerners are looking for.
Sure. Absolutely. Just let me say just a quick mention about Eastman. Certainly he was not in any danger on safari. However, hunting in the old days, or early 19th century and later in the, late 19th century, early 20th century, was a slightly more risky or riskier prospect because the guns weren't as high caliber. They were significantly more inaccurate. And so you actually did stand a real chance of shooting an elephant half a dozen times, if not more, and without abating its charge whatsoever. So the rifle power that they had back then was significantly less lethal than it is today. That is not to excuse Eastman or Roosevelt or any of those folks who wantonly killed many more animals than they needed to on hunting expeditions. That aside, yeah, I mean, the camera safari is really the bedrock of the tourism industry in contemporary Africa. When I poll my students, that's what they all want to do. They all want to go on safari. There's no one mentioning, even for example, visiting gorillas, mountains in the mist in Uganda or anything like that. It's invariably safari. They have these notions, and these notions are reinforced that African wildlife runs unrestricted throughout the continent, when in fact, of course, they're in game reserves, game parks, essentially large or extremely large zoos, but they're still delineated, in which no humans reside because they were forcibly removed many years ago. So the camera safari replaced hunting safaris generally around the end of the colonial period, because the colonial administrators realized that animals alive were worth a lot more than animals dead. And so, I mean, there's a passage in the book, and I can't remember where, like in 1960, I think the Kenyan government conducted a study, and a single lion is worth $7,000, or was worth $7,000 or something like that at the time. Not nearly so much more so than it would be had it been killed by a hunting safari tourist. And so they quickly warmed to that, partially for economic reasons, less so for moralistic reasons. And so now, of course, every country that has any sort of fauna that's of appeal to Westerners or tourists coming from beyond the continent's borders really promote this. So even in countries like in West Africa, Ghana and Togo, for example, had very, very small populations of what we would think of as sort of big game, have incorporated those into their sort of broader tourism array of destinations. But of course, most of this is going on in Southern Africa and Eastern Africa, where big game is much more prevalent. And so they had a significant advantage from a touristic perspective upon independence. They had these sort of faunal assets that weren't really available to some of the other newly independent states. It's almost ironic when you're thinking about, not ironic, but it's sort of amusing to think about tourism and going back to the Berlin conference when Europeans were sitting around dividing up the continent. I mean, some of these spaces had so much more touristic value, but of course that was the farthest thing from their mind at the time. But in fact, they're very real, very powerful sort of repercussions for the choices they made from a touristic perspective in contemporary Africa. Yes, it's perceived as sort of a once in a lifetime experience by most folks. And to be perfectly honest, I've been on safari probably a dozen times. It's really not that interesting after you go once. So it truly ought to be a once in a lifetime experience, because you end up seeing sort of the same animals over again, just in a slightly different setting. And so there's absolutely a wow factor, the first time you sort of do it, and it becomes decreasingly compelling or impressive with successive safari experiences. But interesting that I think this goes back to an earlier question that you had, is that sometimes the folks who return from Africa are much more dangerous, in a sense, in reinforcing misperceptions and misunderstandings about the continent, because they have such a very insulated, scripted experience on the continent. And there's no more so scripted experience than safaris, where you're often picked up at the airport, whisked away to your game lodge, which is either within a park or a reserve, whether it's public or private, or just on the fringes. You're only interacting with a very small set of individuals who are absolutely in the service industry, who speak perfect English, and you're sort of wined and dined in a way. I mean, these are not inexpensive undertakings. And you're brought into the park, and what you see suggests that Africa is very sparsely populated, is very comfortable, but also very dangerous, and that everyone is nice and welcoming. And I mean, all the sort of stereotypes about the African safari experience feed these sort of misperceptions and misunderstandings of contemporary and historic Africa. And you sort of drive around in game parks or reserves or whatever for most of the day, and then return. And upon returning, again, there's more food and drink available, and sort of you're always very comfortable, even if there are. I think what most people don't know is if you go somewhere on safari that's reasonably expansive, you may be out for 8 or 10 hours, and you'll go hours at a time without seeing anything of note. And so they also tend to be, there's a lot of boredom during a safari as well. But also that sort of feeds this notion of this expansive, unoccupied, pristine land, because you can also drive hours and not see anybody else. If you're in Kruger, say, for example, some of the outer areas in Kruger. And so again, the safari experience, the camera safari experience, which is so central to contemporary tourism, is also problematic in so many respects too, even if it's an enjoyable endeavor. And I try not to be, what was the old Debbie Downer? I mean, even in the introduction of the book, I say, like, if I've already talked you out of going out, traveling to Africa as a tourist, that was not my intention. But I am hoping that my students and others who read the book will be more critically engaged and think more critically about the undertaking.
Yeah, and be well-informed travelers when they go to. And is the photo here a kind of a traffic jam in a safari tour?
Absolutely, and that's a sort of irony. I think I took this in Kruger, is that when an animal of significance is located, all the safari operators radio each other. And then if you're just driving around in a private car, you sort of see where everybody's heading, and then you head there yourselves. So what you can't see in that picture is there are probably 15 or 20 more vehicles lined up in front of those trucks. So, I mean, contradicting what I just said, you may go hours and see no one, and then you may suddenly see hundreds of people gathered around. And if you're not there at the right moment and the animal's already sort of moved away, then when it's your time to sort of get up into the space where you could have viewed it had you been there, there's nothing there, and then you're sort of confused as to why there are so many cars bunched up. So it's all this sort of game you play over the course of a day, and some of it's kind of ludicrous, frankly.
Yeah, but it reminds me, like, whale watching, the same, suddenly
exactly
gathered in the same area, or Yellowstone, you see, and suddenly you have cars. We have the same phenomena.
Absolutely.
That's interesting. What I really like in your book is that you paid attention to the workers, to African workers, and this dimension is uncommon in books on tourism history. We often tend to forget that people behind the industry were necessary to make it happen. And you also include in your discussion female workers and labor migration within Africa. This is fantastic. And I think your new book is partially on labor tourism, or labor, the dimension of labor and tourism. And maybe towards the end, you can tell us more about this new book. One thing that was, however, missing in the book is the place of African tourists in your story. And of course, for most Africans, have not been able to freely move from point A to point B until recently. But with fast growing middle class in many African countries, we may expect more African tourists in many African countries in the coming decade.
Yep.
Can you tell us a little bit more about African tourists? And of course, I cannot ask you to, in a few minutes to talk about the whole continent, but maybe places best.
Absolutely. It's a great question. And I think I addressed it in the introduction, indicating that that African tourists were going to be not part of the scope of this book, because I was more interested in this sort of dynamic between Africans and global communities, kind of as per the series. But you're absolutely correct. I mean, it is a conspicuous absence at times. That said, if you were to go on safari, say in Etosha or Kruger or somewhere, or Kenya, Tanzania, a very, very small percentage of the tourists would be African. It's simply not an industry that, or it's not an experience that's, for whatever reasons, overly appealing to even Africans of means. And so if I'm, obviously estimating, but if you went on a safari, maybe fewer than 5% of the clientele would be African, many of whom might be infinitely more wealthy than I, but it's just not something that's really caught on. Perhaps it's considered still a Western sort of experience, and animals that might have been not visible, but that locals may have been aware of their entire lives, hold less appeal or less exotic in a way. But of course, there are more Africans sort of involved in tourism in general. I would say mostly, rather than as tourists, more as entrepreneurs. So opening up, especially cultural tourism destinations, ecotourism destinations, sort of smaller scale tourist endeavors that don't require as much capital, but appeal to domestic audiences, probably more so than international audiences. So they're participating in a really interesting way in the industry, but in sort of perhaps less conventional, more novel ways. But there are, of course, African tourists that are taking part in some of these things. But I mean, so if you go to a safari lodge, for example, you'll be out all day on safari, and then at night you'll usually be treated to some sort of drumming or dancing by Africans, and they're sort of playing on the stereotypes and tropes of Africa, or Africans rather. And that, I think, would be off-putting, because I think it's not that it's not authentic, but it's not something that would be done spontaneously at night in front of a foreign audience. I mean, it's purely for Western consumption, so that we can understand that Africans have a tradition of drumming and dancing. That I could see that being very objectionable to a middle-class, well-educated African tourist. But of course, Western tourists lap it up and take, countless photographs of these African performers who are dressed in minimal, often, and traditional attire, but who shortly after the performance are going to change into Western attire and get on their smartphones. But that, of course, that's not intended to be visible for the Western audience. And so there's all sorts of dynamics in a way. But your point about African tourism is a good one. And in doing the research for the other book on Mozambique, I was able to talk to a Black individual, South African, who traveled to Mozambique during apartheid. This was almost exceptional, but not entirely so. And also to an Indian family that had traveled from Durban in South Africa to Mozambique, and also colored, which is a racial designation in South Africa, utilized primarily during apartheid, but it's sort of persisted. And there was a place in Kruger Park during apartheid that non-white individuals could stay. It was basically just a field, but it was permissible. And so there are perhaps even deeper sort of histories of African tourism that have sort of yet to be really reconstructed.
Great, thank you. I have more questions. I don't know, like, if Sarah would like to open the floor.
Well, we do have a question from Patricia Lorsand. Maybe I'll read that one out, but you can certainly continue to pose your questions as well, Igor. We can kind of alternate if we want between the chat.
Great.
So Patricia is looking forward to reading your book and is wondering, in taking West and East Africa that are different in many ways, she's wondering, what are the distinctions between English and French former colonies? For example, Kenya and Tanzania, and the Ivory Coast or Senegal. in what ways has the legacy of these countries played out into the way that tourism is presented or undertaken?
Ooh, that's a really good question. I'm going to speak very generally. In general, colonized peoples in Francophone spaces were offered slightly more opportunities, employment opportunities during the colonial period. So I think that the labor force emerging from colonialism, the indigenous labor force, would have been slightly more skilled, had slightly more access to education, but also vocational institutions in which they would have learned skills like waitering and things like that, that were obviously very useful post-independence. Unfortunately for France, and this goes back to Berlin in 1884-85, the British selected territories that had much more touristic appeal, although of course that did not inform their decisions at the time. And so emerging from independence, during independence, I mean, the British had Kenya, which was sort of outside of South Africa, and Egypt would have been the most desirable tourist destination. And so there were much more significantly more developed tourist infrastructure in many of the British colonies, because of the sort of faunal assets, beaches, all the other things that were appealing to sort of Western or global Northern visitors. And so by pure luck, in many respects, if you were a former British colony, there was a better chance that you were already going to be blessed with a whole array of touristic assets that most of the former French colonies don't have. So if you think about West Africa, Senegal is probably the premier destination in Francophone sub-Saharan Africa for tourists, primarily from France or other Francophone countries in Europe. And that would pale in comparison to even Ghana, for example, but certainly the places in the former British colonies in Eastern and Southern Africa, which have significant large animal populations, beaches, much more temperate climates, which is also appealing to visitors. West Africa can be a climatically uncomfortable place many times for much of the year. And so, again, sort of by luck of the draw, the British ended up with more significant touristic assets than did the French.
Yeah, that's very interesting. I'd like to, there was one aspect that we haven't discussed so far is what you discuss in chapter 6, going home, the diasporic quest for belonging through roots tourism. Mm-hmm. And here you introduce us to heritage tourists, namely African Americans visiting Africa to see these European-built castles where slaves were gathered before the Middle Passage. And I found this chapter very important. I think that you could write a whole book on this topic.
There have been.
The chapter is too short. And you address several important issues. One of them is the perceptions of local, how they perceive African American tourists, and I think they were like on both sides disappointment, and African Americans were surprised to be perceived as any other white foreigners by locals. Mm-hmm. And this tells how much tourism is embedded into global capitalistic system. And you can maybe tell us a little bit about it, but also there is one passage here in this chapter in page 140 where you talk about your personal experience, how you were powerfully, when you visited those castles, you were very much how can I say impressed. And I would like more broadly also to know how your personal experience shaped the writing of the book.
Yeah, and it's a great question. It's a fascinating topic, and I've been fortunate enough to observe, participate, but also observe tour groups moving through those spaces. So one of the primary destinations for heritage tourists, or who are typically African American, although sometimes African descendant in other places in the Western Hemisphere, they visit the castles that were not originally built to house slaves, but which ultimately became their primary purpose. And these are very powerful moments for the individuals in these tour groups. And so oftentimes as you're going through, and the government, the Ghanaian government has gone to great lengths to restore and maintain these buildings, these structures that were built either by the Portuguese or British or another English imperial or European imperial powers. They move through, and this is very much about, although they don't have any sort of direct connection, most slaves did not emanate from Ghana, but Ghana sort of capitalized on this industry. And so it's sort of it fills in for any other place you might be from. And so when they move through these tours, the docents offer a very sort of different narrative, this sort of narrative of victimization, this idea that you're connecting in a meaningful way with your ancestors, and you're sharing in their pain, but you're also, because you've returned, you're somehow reconnecting with them, even though, you know, figuratively and symbolically, and very importantly. And so oftentimes, not oftentimes, every time I've been on these, I've probably stood in or just on the fringes of some of these heritage tour groups. There invariably be individuals who break down and are bawling, frankly. And so just the raw emotion is really powerful, and you can understand how meaningful it is to these individuals. And so, and then if you go on a tour with primarily white Americans, the guides talk a lot more about the architecture of the structures, when they were, what was added on at what point. That used to be a church. So that there's a very sort of different narrative. I mean, they're not hiding this sort of history of slavery in these particular sites, but it's a strikingly divergent narrative. And I've done it enough times in both ways to understand that it's reasonably consistent too. Some of the you mentioned this, Igor, some of the disappointment that these African tourists or African American tourists have is the inability to sort of connect with Africans who perceive them as wealthy Westerners first and foremost, more than any more than they're concerned with any sort of racial affinity. And so many African American tourists come over to the continent thinking they're going to make these sort of instant connections to Africans based on race, but they're often, as you mentioned, in Ghana in particular, the word for foreigner, which is largely the same word for white in Twi, is Obruni. And Ghanaians will call African Americans Obrunis, which to them is unfathomable. They can't, you know, they're there to make these sort of connections rather than to be labeled as the other, which is essentially what's happening. And so there's all sorts of disconnects. And I've also been in very uncomfortable settings where Ghanaians will approach me afterward, knowing that I'm from America or whatever. We've struck up a conversation at dinner, and basically assume that I don't like African Americans. And so they'll start criticizing them openly to me and say, like, oh, I can't stand African Americans. They're the worst. They're so demanding. They don't tip, you know, they're not polite to us or anything like that. And there's sort of this assumption that I'm going to, you know, load on that sentiment, and I'm going to contribute my own thoughts to that conversation, but they're always very uncomfortable. And then I've also, when African Americans know that I'm American, they'll also ask me, like, well, I don't understand, you know, why are they being so rude to us? Or do they treat you the same way? And so there's all sorts of misunderstandings and disconnects between the various parties. And the dynamics are fascinating in a way as much as they are troubling as well, because there's so much disappointment based around, and especially in Ghana, for example. I mean, Kwame Nkrumah, who was the first president of Ghana, was a Pan-Africanist and very much wanted African Americans to be part of the country's history, invited many over. W.E. Du Bois is buried there along with his wife. I mean, there's a long history of connections between the diaspora and Ghana. And so there's this assumption when African American or heritage tourists come that, you know, the nation's waiting for them with open arms and can't wait to embrace and engage. And that's simply not the case. There's also a little bit of an issue in Western African countries, places where most of the slaves who made it to the Americas derived, because if you think about it, the Africans who are there now were the ones who were not victimized by slavery. Somehow, some way, their ancestors were able to evade capture and transport across the Atlantic. And so when people come back the people who come back were the ones who were victimized by slavery in one fact, not themselves necessarily, obviously, but their ancestors. And so there's that divide, and slavery is not taught. We probably spend more time on transatlantic slavery in America during middle school, junior high, high school than do Ghanaian students. It's sort of an uncomfortable part of their history because, again, if you're Ghanaian and you're still in Ghana, you were not a victim of the slave trade, and perhaps your ancestors participated actively in it. And so it can be a very uncomfortable subject. So when African Americans arrive, or these heritage tourists arrive, and slavery is central to the narrative, to their history, to this heritage, it's not for Ghanaians who are offering tours, serving them drinks, etc. Slavery is sort of a part of an uncomfortable past they don't really want to talk about, rather than something they want to embrace and engage and challenge. And so there's that divide too that's very awkward, because these are individuals whose ancestors were not victims of slavery. That narrative, it's unfortunate, it's tragic, but they have a very sort of different lineage. And so there are all sorts of disconnects, and there are very awkward and uncomfortable moments during those sorts of engagements. I'm not suggesting that they all are. I'm sure there have been many genuine comings together, if you will, during these experiences, but they're advertised in one way, and in practice they often turn out to be something very different. Now, that doesn't mean that they're not powerful. Many African Americans have gone on these heritage trips numerable times, and so they keep coming back to keep making these connections, these sort of fictive connections to their past, even though most likely they're not from Ghana or anywhere near it. Thank you.
That was also a fascinating chapter to me. And one thing that caught my attention, both in the early chapters, sort of about 19th century, mostly European travelers to the continent, and particularly initially Northern Africa and Egypt, so forth.
Mm-hmm.
And then again in this section is that even though, particularly in the earlier period, there's this sort of gendered notion that it's dangerous and it's these heroic men who go, that so many of the travel accounts that you draw on are actually published by women.
Yeah.
And then even in this Roots chapter, it seems like a lot of the discussion, apparently, that's been going on, it's many, Saidiya Hartman and others have written about this too. And I don't know if this was just coincidental or if there was some.
Oh, wow. How to connect those two. That's interesting. Yeah. So there's this whole little, of course, the history of tour guides and tour books have been dominated by men to Africa because, they were these courageous sort of individuals who traveled into this dangerous space. And so they were, of course, essentially the only ones who could write about it initially, until women started participating on these tours to Egypt and wrote sort of profusely in memoirs and travel guides and things like that about the Egyptian experience. So that's their sort of intervention in a way into this otherwise male-dominated genre. But you're right. Sort of more recently, some of the most significant contributors to literature on these returns or heritage tourism have been women. Wow, how to connect those?
Yeah, there may be no connection, but it really, I was struck that that the stories seem to be told.
Yeah, it's that you're absolutely right. Yeah, I don't on the spot. I'm not sure I have
but it's not. Is it? Are there that the Roots sort of tourism, heritage tourism, is drawing equally from men and women? It just happens that women are blogging and writing about it more, do you think, or is it also attracting more women?
That's a good question. I would say that there's a gendered balance. I think if most of those tours that I've either jumped in on or witnessed have been roughly similar in terms of the gender balance. Yeah, it's a lot of couples, it's a lot of retired couples, but it's also a lot of younger, sort of late 20s, early 30s, African-American professionals who are obviously doing well and want to make those same sorts of connections. It's almost never little kids, though, oddly. Maybe that feeds into this sort of lingering or durable perception of Africa as a dangerous place. And, of course, the first thing you do when you decide to go to Africa is get all these vaccinations. And so it still seems, well before you've ever set foot there, it seems like a very dangerous place and you need to be protected in all these different ways. But yeah, I don't know. I'll think about that this afternoon, actually. If there's
Those are some pretty serious tours to go on with a younger child.
Fair enough, for sure. Yes, even safari, and I've outlined the experience a little bit. You're up at the crack of dawn, you're gone all day. I have a funny little anecdote. We were with our kids maybe 4 or 5 years ago in Kruger, and of course you get up at 4:30, and we just told the kids, don't worry about it. You can sleep, and we'll wake you up if there's something noteworthy or worth seeing. So we come across this cluster, a family of warthogs, and they're crossing the road. It's very adorable. And so we wake up our younger kid and say, hey, get up, get up, get up. And so he pops up, looks around, clearly sees the warthogs, but is not at all interested. And then turns back to me and glaringly says, do not wake me up for just a warthog, and proceeded to go immediately back to sleep. So, I mean, you're right. That point is that, yeah, some of this type of tourism in Africa doesn't lend itself to, having small kids along.
Yeah. We're getting close to the end of the hour. Patricia Lord Sand put in another question, and you do have a very interesting account in the book about colonial nostalgia and sort of package tours that actually build on that. So if you want to sort of quickly address that, then.
Sure. I mean, there are lodges, safari lodges in 2023 in Eastern Africa that intentionally have sort of a colonial motif. So there are pith helmets and mosquito netting and stuff. And these places are typically extremely expensive. So you're paying sort of to have an experience that's no longer really possible if you can reconcile those two. And so obviously the colonial dynamics are there. It's primarily white clientele, although there are increasing numbers of Asian tourists. But also you have almost uniformly Black African staff. And so even at higher level positions now, thankfully, those are populated by Black Africans. And so you have the sort of racial, asymmetrical power dynamic. You have these sort of the colonial motif that you're actually paying for rather than just sort of stumbled into. So you're very much buying that experience. You're aiming for that experience. That doesn't mean that you're necessarily going to treat the wait staff poorly or anything like that. But I mean, you have to be aware that you're entering into that and be aware of the dynamics, the historical dynamics that suggests. I mean, that environment suggests. And so that's something that certain individuals obviously strive to experience. And like I said, it's not inexpensive. Someone who studies colonial Africa, in a way, everything about colonialism is objectionable and detestable, but I can never really understand what the human dynamics were like. I can only reconstruct them as a historian would. And so there's a part of me that, well, for example, Alan was able to travel and Lusophone colonized Africa in a way and has insights that I'll never be able to have because I never actually experienced it. I don't have a longing for it or anything like that, but I find these safari settings or these colonial settings perverse, but there's clearly a nostalgia for it. And there's a nostalgia for it for people who never experienced it in the first place, oddly. I mean, that's almost ironic that they're trying to relive something that they never lived in the first place.
Well, thank you. And we have another question. Unfortunately, hopefully Michael Worley can hang around afterwards and we can continue the conversation about maybe a more positive side. We sort of ended on one of the more negative aspects of tourism in Africa. But I do want to thank you, Todd, for bringing this really interesting book to us, and Igor for your really terrific questions. It was a really great conversation. And to all of you who took time out today to attend. The event has been recorded, and so if you want to come back and visit or share it with others, you will get a link in the email. And you'll also get an invitation to our next book club, which will be Wednesday. We'll be back on our regular Wednesdays, May 10th at noon, with Margot Canaday, PhD alum and professor at Princeton, about her book, Queer Career, Sexuality and Work in Modern America. And she'll be in conversation with Barbara Welke, who's also in the Zoom audience today. So we'll look forward to that one. And Clayton has already put a registration link in as well. We also invite you, Clayton will put in a link if you would like to support the graduate students who will, like Todd and Margot, go on and publish these excellent books. You can make a donation to our graduate fellowships fund as well. So with that, we'll close out the formal program, but I do invite people to stay around if they have a few minutes, and we can unmute and just have an informal conversation and greet Todd and Igor. So thank you very much.